Thank you again for your participation. We appreciate the first panel's efforts and really insightful. We kind of touched the tip of the iceberg on some of these issues and moved through it rather quickly, but we have a lot to cover and a great amount of knowledge being represented by these panelists. The next issue that we are going to go over is new security challenges, chaos, crime, cyber, and terror. William M. Bowden is our moderator, and he is a distinguished scholar at the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and he's assistant professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. He is a non-resident fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Previously, William served as senior director for strategic planning on the National Security Council at the White House. William's going to introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's a real honor to be here with everybody. I'd like to echo my friend and colleague Frank Evans' remarks at the beginning of the previous panel. How this is a wonderful opportunity for the Strauss Center and the Greater Austin Crime Commission to come together and collaborate and serve the community as we are exploring areas of common interest and concern. And I thought I would start introducing the panel on a brief biographical note on a vignette from a previous part of my career that illustrated for me how a lot of these global security issues really can be local as well. I'm a native of Tucson, Arizona originally, and growing up in Tucson, developed an interest in foreign policy and national security policy, and decided if I wanted to pursue those interests, I needed to live overseas, work in Washington, move away from Tucson eventually, and so I did. And about 15 years after moving away from Tucson, I found myself working at the National Security Council in Washington on a number of issues related to long-term threats and opportunities for America's national security, including counter-radicalization and counterterrorism. And while I was at the NSC working with our counterterrorism team, we started tracking a jihadist cell that was actually active in Tucson, just even looking at their location not far from where I'd grown up. And we tracked the cell over a number of months, and fortunately before they were able to act and before it ever became public, we were able to roll them up and mitigate the threat. But for me, this really illustrated kind of this irony that here I had thought that the way to get involved in these kind of national and global security issues, I need to move away from Tucson and go to Washington and go around the world, when in fact, when I'm there in Washington, I'm seeing that these issues are very alive and well in Tucson and many other cities around the country. I know that's certainly it's a concern very familiar to the local law enforcement issues here. I think our panel today is a nice segue from the previous panel, which was very informative and brought a number of new insights related to cross-border issues, especially a number of the concerns going on in Mexico. And our panel will be picking up on some of those, particularly with our first presenter, Jen Hazen. But our panel will also be trying to look at the broader global context for a number of these concerns of chaos, of crime, of terrorism, and of cyber threats. So our first presenter is going to be Dr. Jen Hazen, who is one of my colleagues with the Strauss Center and at the LBJ School. You can see her full bio in here, but I think suffice to say she brings a wonderful combination of academic expertise as well as practical implementation experience with the State Department and International Crisis Group, among others, on these issues. And she'll be talking about drug cartels in Mexico. And then I'll just mention a brief word on Fred Chang as well, who also brings a wonderful combination of academic expertise, policy experience from his time with the National Security Agency, and private sector experience from his previous career with Bell Communications. And he'll be drawing on all three of those dimensions of his own background to talk about cyber threats and cybersecurity. And then finally, I wish I could be introducing Dr. Ami Petizur to you, who is our resident expert on terrorism. Unfortunately, he's taken ill and is not able to be with us today, and so I will be filling in and offering a few of my own thoughts on terrorism with the disclaimer that Ami has forgotten more about terrorism than I've ever learned, but hopefully I'll be able to share a few things of some information. So with that, we'll turn it over to Jen Hazen. Thanks.
Good morning. I hope you can see me over this. I think I need a step stool. Good morning. My name is Jennifer Hazen. I'm a research fellow here at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And first, I want to thank Will for his introduction. And I also want to thank, I think they may not be here anymore, but Admiral Inman and Frank Gavin and Celeste Ward-Venter for inviting me, as well as the Austin Crime Commission for inviting me to speak today. I want to point out that the sort of speakers this morning, I'm not going to repeat what they say. Actually, it actually ends up working out really well so that we had Dr. Ainsley give a very micro-level view of Juarez. Dr. Lauderdale gave the more sort of macro perspective, and I'm actually going to sort of fit right in the middle. So hopefully we will complement each other. And so really what I'm trying to come at in giving you this presentation is to try and understand the drug cartels and their violence and try to understand what this really means for the Mexican state. Is this really a threat to the Mexican state in terms of failed states, in terms of stability, or are we really talking about a threat to the type of state that Mexico is? Is it really a threat to democracy and the risk of a narco state or a narco-democracy as opposed to really having a threat to Mexico in terms of it being a failed state? And why do I come to this? Well, first, in 2008, 2009, you saw a lot of, these are news headlines and sort of comments about Mexico that were coming out in 2008, 2009, really posing the question of, is Mexico at risk of being a failed state? And this came out of the concern of 2008, 2009 when you saw the escalation in violence. And in a minute, I'll show you a chart of that violence, right? And so a lot of people started to talk about this, is this really a rising threat? Are we going to see a failed state in Mexico? And a lot of people said, no, that's not it. And then maybe some of you will remember last September in an unfortunate statement by the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton that really Mexico was now at risk of a drug insurgency, right? And so she compared Mexico to Colombia in the 1980s and said, now, Mexico's at threat of insurgency. And immediately the Obama administration stepped back and said, no, we didn't mean that. That's not the problem in Mexico. Mexican government, probably rightly so, said, we're not a failed state. It's not an insurgency. We do have a significant law and order and crime problem, but these aren't the issues, right? So, but why is there such concern? And I hope you can see this. It's probably a little hard to see from where you are. So it goes from 2001 to 2010. These are the crime statistics or the homicide statistics for drug-related or organized crime-related homicides in Mexico from 2001 to 2010.
Jennifer, what are the numbers?
Oh, sorry. It goes from about, it's really hard to see, 2,000 up to 6. The top line is 18,000. Sorry. And so you can see very clearly that there's been an immense escalation of violence in, I'm just going to yell. It's sort of 2008, 2009, 2010. But you can see that, organized crime, it's hard to see on this scale, but was slowly creeping up into 2006. 2006 December is when Calderon administration comes into power. And then you see it rise in 2007, and then a dramatic increase in 2008, 2009, and 2010. And I'll just point out that the blue statistics are from the National Human Rights Commission. The red statistics are from Reforma, which is the Mexico City-based newspaper that's widely respected for collecting these kinds of statistics. The green is the recently released government statistics. And we can talk about the validity of statistics later if you have questions about that. But I do want to point out that between 2007 and 2010, so mainly the Calderon administration, you have what is estimated at about 35,000 homicides related to the drug trade or organized crime alone. And in 2010 alone, it's estimated to be above around 15,000 deaths. And I should point out, although it's not on this chart, that the number of homicides related to organized crime and the drug trade, the percentage of those has increased over time. So let me explain that slightly better, which is homicides related to organized crime or the drug trade accounted for about 10% of the homicides in Mexico in 1998. In 2010, they're estimated to account for two-thirds of the homicides. And I should also point out that up until about 2007, the homicide rate in Mexico had actually been declining. And so in 2007, it was 11 homicides per 100,000 people in the population. Sorry, it's a sort of public health type statistic. But to give you a comparison, the global average is about 7 per 100,000, and the US in 2009 was 5 per 100,000. So that gives you a sense. But in the 1990s and before, that rate was actually in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s in Mexico per 100,000. So we actually were seeing a decline in the homicide. That rate's now started to go back up, and most people believe that the reason why the overall national homicide rate has increased is because of the rise in the drug-related, organized crime-related homicide. Okay, so I've given you lots of numbers. What does this all mean? Well, I would argue that the situation was actually improving in Mexico up until 2007 when you saw these spikes in drug-related homicides in Mexico. And now you're seeing a bit of a switch in the other direction. But, as I will show you in the next slides, we need to be careful in how we talk about this violence. There's a lot of reporting that, sort of large swaths of Mexico are now under the control of drug cartels and, it's a failed state and all of this. And I think we really need to focus on where is the violence happening and what does that mean and who are the victims of this violence. And the violence is not evenly distributed across the country, and it's not affecting the population in the same way. Let me just start back and say, on the point of whether Mexico is a failed state or not, I actually looked at a variety of indices, and you can't read these, but these are sort of Freedom House and Polity for Data and the Political Instability Task Force State Fragility Index. They're all indexes to try and measure state fragility, weakness of state, whether states are going to fail. And on all of these indices, for the most part, Mexico might have declined a little bit. On a couple of them, it stayed the same between 2007 and 2010, and on one of them it actually improved. So all to say, if you look at all these different indices, most people would say Mexico is not a failing state. It's not at risk of failure. Is it a weak state? Yes. Is it a consolidated democracy? No. It certainly has its challenges, and where the scores on these indices have declined, most people attribute that to this drug-related violence. So that's just a side note. And so when we look at the threat, what I want to sort of go through in the next couple of slides is to say, what is the threat? And this is what I posed at the beginning of my talk. Are we really talking about a threat to the state, which could be measured in terms of attacks against the state, insurgency, or support to other armed groups? Or are we really talking about a threat to the type of the state, and really corruption, targeted violence, the potential for the population to turn to the cartels and look for security and services from them as opposed to the state? And the potential that some people are raising now that the cartels and the government, whoever is elected in 2012, will cut a deal. And so what you will see is a significant reduction in the violence, if that should happen, but you aren't going to actually see a reduction in organized crime or a reduction in the drug trade. Okay, so let's look at the sort of statistics about homicide. Again, I apologize if you can't read this very well, but all you need to sort of really know is that this is the map for 2010. These are the number of homicides per state within Mexico, and the darkest areas are the highest rates. Okay? And so I want to show this picture to say, if you look at this picture of Mexico, you would immediately think, wow, the situation is serious. There's violence everywhere. The Mexican state's imploding. It's got no control, what have you, right? It's a scary picture. If you look at the drug-related homicides by municipality as opposed to by state, so we're looking at the more local level, you start to see a very different picture. You start to see that the violence is really concentrated in certain areas, Juarez being one of them, and a couple of other areas, right? So it's a very different picture of violence, a very concentrated violence in certain parts of Mexico. And again, sort of really dark is the highest level of violence. The pale part is sort of between, let me get my stats real quick, sort of between 0 and sort of 58 deaths or homicides in the year, or in the pale parts. Now, this isn't to downplay the violence or the horrific manner in which the violence has been taking place, but it's to really focus our attention on where it's happening, and to be very clear that it's not widespread across the state or across Mexico as a whole. And if we look at this, these are maps produced by the federal government of Mexico that looks at the municipalities that account for 70% of the drug-related homicides. So basically, these are the highest These are the places with the highest incident of drug-related homicides, and again, you see even more concentrated picture of where the violence is taking place. And in fact, according to these statistics, you actually have fewer municipalities being affected by high levels of violence than you did in 2007. And the violence is largely believed to result from three sources. It's cartel-to-cartel violence, so it's cartels fighting over territory, fighting over drug routes. It's intra-cartel violence. This is violence that has resulted from either the loss of leadership through arrests or through the deaths of leaders, and you get these struggles for leadership control of the cartels, resulting in intra-cartel violence. You also have violence used within cartels to discipline members, so that's part of it as well. And then you also have violence that is in response to the military and police actions taken by the Mexican government. And really, if you look at the patterns of violence, and I'll show you in a minute the areas of influence of the cartels, you'll see that the violence largely maps onto these areas. And so if you look at this chart, hopefully a little bit more readable to those of you in the audience, this actually demonstrates that the violence is mainly between the cartels. You can question sort of the gathering of these statistics, but what it shows is that the vast majority of those who are killed are believed to be either within inter-cartel violence or those who are related to the drug trade. Now, human rights organizations and others will say this doesn't account for those extrajudicial killings and so forth. A lot of complaints about the military and about the police in Mexico and how they are responding. But overwhelmingly, if this is even close to an accurate picture, again, the violence is mainly between the cartels and within, amongst those who are related to the drug trade. And I also want to say that the inter-cartel violence, while predominant, is actually exacerbated by some other dynamics. I think it was mentioned earlier that part of the government of Mexico's strategy is to, he used a nicer term than I'm going to use, is to decapitate the cartels, right? Either through arrest or through the death of the cartel leaders, get rid of the head, and the idea being that the cartels will then disintegrate if you can remove the leader of the cartel. This is similar to the strategy that was used in Colombia, and in Colombia it worked. You got the sort of breakup of the cartels into much smaller drug trafficking organizations. The same idea is being used in Mexico. If you can get rid of the leader, they can break up. They'll be at a smaller level. They'll be less, they'll be weaker and less of a problem for local law enforcement or for the military to deal with. And so this strategy has produced successes. 2010 had the most successes in terms of arrests and deaths of the cartel leaders and high-ranking cartel membership. And this has weakened the cartels. But the dynamic I was talking about is that you sort of set in motion this, you weaken one cartel, and then a cartel next door, and I think we talked earlier about the Sinaloa versus the Juarez, the cartel next door, it's a bit stronger, says, hey, now it's time to take over territory. So then that increases the inter-cartel violence. All right. And so you get this kind of circle of violence that I'm not going to blame the military of Mexico for, but certainly it contributes to these dynamics of violence that are taking place in Mexico. Now, I want to show you two maps of the areas of influence of the drug cartels. And let me first note that these are really rough estimates. This does not mean that the cartels control all of this territory, and they're really rough in terms of saying this is where the cartels operate, this is where they have some influence. This is from 2007. And what you can see from this is that you kind of have a clear delineation between the cartels of the routes they control and where they operate. Now, if you look at this map, and it was shown earlier, you see a much different picture in 2010. Right? There's a lot of overlap of the cartels. There's a lot of fighting between the cartels. There's a lot of switching sides between different cartels and different alliances. And you actually have more cartels. So the picture becomes much more complicated in 2010. And so what I want to do is then just return briefly to this question of, is it a threat to the state? I would argue that given what has been the evidence on the ground, that the attacks against the state actually are mainly directed toward military when the military attacks the cartels. Overall, the estimate is that some 90% of the drug-related homicides or deaths are the cartels or drug trafficking-related individuals, 7% are military or state representatives, and 3% are the civilian population. So again, the statistics might not be accurate sort of down to the percentage point, but if that's the relative trend, it gives you a sense of who's being attacked, who's being affected by the violence. And for the most part, no one's marching on Mexico City, right? There's not a direct threat against the state. The cartels are not trying to overthrow the state. And I should step back and say, you know, organized crime really prefers to be under the radar, right? Violence is a sign that organized crime is not functioning well, right? Because normally if it's functioning well, yes, they use violence and yes, they use intimidation, but you do not see the kinds of levels of violence that you see now in Mexico. Is it a threat of an insurgency? Again, there's no evidence that the cartels are really acting in sort of as insurgents and again trying to overthrow the state. There's been some discussion that the cartels have been supporting other armed groups. The concern there is less about the Mexican state, more about the US, and the concern that the Mexican cartels could assist with the transiting of either terrorists or weapons of mass destruction into the US through their drug trafficking routes. But again, that's a US issue, not less of a Mexican issue. So anyhow, I just want to conclude and say that really what seems to be happening in Mexico is much more a threat to the type of state we might have in Mexico. There's widespread reports of corruption. This weakens the rule of law. This enables cartels to buy off the police. There's a limited incentive to enforce the rule of law. You know, there's a saying in Mexico, money or lead, like either take our money or we'll kill you. And when you're a sort of police officer making a few $100s a month and you're offered a few $1,000s a week, you know, there are some incentives there for looking the other way and not being shot. This reduces the security of the population overall. And we're also seeing the corruption influence not just sort of day-to-day looking the other way, but in terms of policy, in terms of the potential for actually implementing reforms on the ground, and influence on political elections. You also see targeted violence. It's not to say that nobody in the state is affected. If you think about the government, mayors have been killed, and it is difficult, increasingly difficult to find people who want to serve and, say, lead the police force in Juarez. The last person was there for a short time, and she, I believe, fled to the US after too many death threats. So it's increasingly difficult to find people, good people, people who are going to be honest to fill a lot of these positions. That is certainly a problem. In terms of the media, there's a lot of effort by the drug cartels to control what the media reports. A number of journalists have been killed, so in fact, media has actually stopped reporting on a lot of the violence. And that's a problem in terms of both freedom of the press, but also just information on what is happening there. And finally, just to comment on what's been raised in terms of sort of the horrific pictures that have been displayed in earlier slides, there is an effort by the cartels to create a popular fear in the population, right? Prior to, say, sort of the mid-2000s, a lot of the cartel violence, it still took place, right? The cartels have been active for decades. This is not a new problem. But the violence was much more sort of behind the scenes, right? Someone described it to me as, you know, they would go take people they weren't happy with out into sort of a deserted area. They'd shoot them, they'd bury them, and that would be it. We wouldn't even really know that it happened. You're seeing a change in the type of violence that's taking place. You're seeing, you know, beheadings. You're seeing heads rolled through discos. You're seeing the narco banners. You're seeing people hung from bridges. You're seeing a very much more public display of violence, which is geared toward increasing the fear in the population, but also trying to turn the population toward the cartels. All right. And the cartels have offered numerous goods to populations. They do not, I want to step back and say, the cartels do not offer a form of governance or a form of administration in any of the areas they operate, right? They're not running schools. They're not running public health services. They're not running administration. What they are doing is trying to sort of buy off acquiescence by the population, and they do that through donating bicycles, toys, food. They've got a famous sort of narco banner that was put up by one of the cartels that said, you know, come join us, we'll give you jobs, medical care, food, life insurance, and loans. So there is this effort to win over the population. And so ultimately, the concern is that you have a population that turns to the cartels for security and for services because it's something the government cannot or will not provide. And that ultimately you might end up with this deal between the cartels and the government for a reduction in violence, cartels get to do their business as usual, and I would argue that you end up with a much less democratic state in Mexico, but it'll be a much less violent state. And so in some respects, if that happens, it'll be claimed as a victory because it's no longer violent, but that might have a lot more far-reaching consequences down the road if you have the cartels able to influence the government up through the highest levels. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer, and now Fred Chang. No, that was great.
Okay, I'm not a Mac person, so I'm gonna. Oh, okay, we got assistance here. Thank you. As he's setting that up, I'd also like to thank the Strauss Center and the Austin Crime Commission. Oh, that was fast. Thank you for inviting me. I'm located down at the other UT, down at UT San Antonio, so it's nice to be invited back to speak here at the mothership. So maybe a good way to start my comments would be to take a line from that old Monty Python bit, and now for something completely different. So we're going to move from the physical world of cartels and beheadings and sort of nasty stuff to the cyber realm. And I'd like to spend just a few minutes with you to talk about cybersecurity and really answer. I've structured the presentation around 4 questions. So I hoped in my brief comments to basically try to get a better understanding about these 4 questions. So to ask, how bad is the problem? Will it affect you? What's being done about it? And what does the future hold? Okay, so how bad is the problem? You've probably read, heard many things about cybersecurity these days, so I thought I'd just give you a little bit of a perspective in a couple minutes to describe how bad the problem is. As a way to set this up, and this is a little bit busy, but I wanted to just give you a flavor for the sort of volume, variety, and velocity of traffic on the internet today. So approximately today, there are about 2 billion users on the internet. In 2010, there were approximately 294 billion email messages sent per day. That's 2.8 million per second. Some days I feel like half of those go to my email box. About 90% of those were spam. So just imagine the volume of spam that's out there. There were 25 billion tweets, so those are Twitter messages. Everybody know what a Twitter message is? In 2010. This one I thought was interesting. Facebook now has over 600 million users. If it were a country, it would be the 3rd largest country on the planet. So China has about, 1.3 billion. India has about 1.2 billion. The US has 311 million. So Facebook, if it were a country with 600 million users, is about the 3rd largest country. By the way, Twitter has about 200 million users. So we're talking about these online services now that are just gigantic, and, by any measure. Do you have kids who watch YouTube videos? So approximately 2 billion YouTube videos are watched per day. So this is just a space that is it just has a huge amount of traffic. Now I have a little bullet there at the bottom that says malware. So malware is basically some form of malicious software. So it's a virus, it's a worm, it's a Trojan. They're all collectively called malware. It turns out that a new piece of malware is introduced in cyberspace now approximately 1 every second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And so just imagine that. So there are about 35 million new pieces of malware, and you can basically think of it as an information system is now a weapon system. And the weapons themselves, the bullets of those weapon systems are malware. So basically, a new bullet, a new piece of digital malicious software is released once per second. I'm going to do a scientific study of this, but I now believe that there is more bad software being released than good software being released And that's just sort of a comment on where we are today. So it's pretty bad. Okay. What are we really up against in cyberspace? This graphic, to me, depicts well what we're up against. And so if you think that the newest state-of-the-art technology, whether it be from hardware, software, whatever company, and you have a sophisticated adversary trying to break into that system, it's about as hard for them to get through as it is for you to walk by that little red gate there. I mean, that's I think, a pretty apt analogy. In the cybersecurity arena, people do what's called white hacking or penetration testing. And so basically a company will hire a group to sort of say, how porous are our defenses? And then they launch some attempts, friendly attempts to break through. The penetration testers are almost always able to get through. And even though people spend lots and lots of money to protect their networks, in fact, against a sophisticated adversary, it's really not very difficult to get through. Here are some statements that folks in the federal government have made. So Joel Brenner, the National Intelligence Executive, back in 2007, he reports, he discloses now that something like 140 foreign intelligence organizations are trying to hack into various military and government systems and in systems in U.S. companies. A year later, he makes a similar statement that basically says there are these pretty small but very intelligent criminal organizations who are attempting these cyber attacks that are similar to what a foreign intelligence agency might have done some years ago. And I just want to give you one little example. So in the brief time I had, I could cite many examples of the threat, but I thought this one was sort of interesting. So this gets back to the what are we really up against in cyberspace. So in 2008, in northern London, there were customers of a supermarket chain that noticed that there were some strange charges to their credit card. And so they would see the collection of groceries that they purchased, that showed up on their credit card. But subsequent to that, there were these strange other charges that they really couldn't account for. And it was happening consistently at customers of this particular supermarket chain in northern London. It turns out that some sort of criminal group had modified the credit card readers. So when you buy a sack of groceries at the supermarket, you go to the checkout stand, you take your credit card, and you swipe it through the credit card reader. You know, everybody does it. And then you sign your name, and you walk out, and you have your groceries. Well, it turns out that this criminal group had implanted a microchip on the motherboard inside the credit card reader. So when the credit card reader took the credit card swipe, those credit card numbers were sent wirelessly to an underground server in Lahore, Pakistan. And once that criminal group had access to the credit card numbers, they started buying big screen TVs and whatever things criminals purchase. So think of the sophistication of what was involved there. So somebody is manufacturing these credit card readers, and there's some sort of supply chain interdiction happening here. And so it turns out that those credit card readers, the ones that were infected compared to the normal ones, the only difference was that the infected ones weighed 4 ounces more. So law enforcement basically had to go around and weigh these credit card readers, and the bad ones weighed 4 ounces more than the regular ones. And can you imagine how undetectable that is? So just think of if a criminal group is willing to go to those measures to get credit card numbers, think of what a sophisticated nation state is likely to do, right? That just sort of gives you an example. We're up. This is a really difficult thing, and you have some very sophisticated adversaries. I won't spend a lot of time on this one, but this is another example of something important that happened in 2010. This is a little bit busy, but it basically talks about the reported hack of the company Google. So think about, think about the, the amount of sophistication that Google, right? So they're an online company. So students in the computer science, the very top students in computer science departments end up getting hired by Google. So these are extremely technical people. They're extremely competent. And you can imagine the level of person they are likely to put on defending their system. And so they end up getting hacked. And they end up getting hacked, and they end up getting hacked badly. And this kind of captured that. We believe that a number of companies were hacked along those same lines, perhaps as many as 30, 40 companies, but only 3, in addition to Google, have disclosed, so Adobe, Juniper, and Rackspace. It's sort of a comment on how reluctant companies are to disclose when they've been compromised. I won't go through the technical details, but trust me that this was really a sophisticated hack. The person who did this really knew what they were doing. It triggered, about a week later, a very important Internet freedom policy address by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. To the students in the audience, I'd encourage you to read that. It really made some powerful things about what should a great nation do. She basically says a great nation shouldn't censor the search results of its residents, and kind of a reaction to the so-called Great Firewall of China, where results are in fact censored. Okay. Giving you a little bit of a perspective on what the nature of the problem is. Now I hope to be able to help you understand, will it affect you? Likely it already has. So these are some factoids from a relatively recent report by one of the antivirus companies, Norton, along with Symantec. They did a survey of something like 7,000 users in 14 different countries, and the results were that 65% of internet users have been victims of cybercrime. And that number rises to nearly 3/4 when you just look at the US. Interestingly, only 9% of people feel very safe online. So basically, there's almost a degree of learned helplessness happening here. I continue to go online, but I really don't feel very safe. Only 3% think that cybercrime won't happen to them, and almost 80% do not believe cybercriminals will be brought to justice. By the way, they are exactly right on that. The statistics are that if you commit a crime in cyberspace, odds are you will not be captured or prosecuted. The results are that approximately less than 5% of cybercriminals actually get caught. You're much more likely to get caught committing a brick-and-mortar crime than you are upon committing a cybercrime. One of the problems with cybersecurity is that there just simply is a really large lack of data. And I mentioned before, companies are really very reluctant to disclose when they've actually been hacked. In this case, there actually is beginning to be some more data about data breaches. So there's this website, privacyrights.org, that has been tracking for about the past 5.25 years data breaches of U.S. residents, and we're now up to so this is something I've been tracking for a while, and so now we're up to 516 million data records of U.S. residents. So that obviously means that some people it happened twice to. So I can tell you personally that it's happened 3 times to me. I've gotten a letter, dear Mr. Chang, we're very sorry, but your bank, your university, your fill in the blank, we've given up your information and we're required by law to disclose it. The disclosure laws are now something like, in about 42 states in the United States, there are disclosure laws that when a company has given up your information, they have to disclose to you that they've done it. And there's some estimates now about, what's the probability that it's happened 1 time, the probability that it's happened 2 times, and so forth. But it's just happening, all the time. Okay, what's being done about it? So I'll give you In fact, I'll remember, there's actually one little Texas-specific example I can give. But I'll give you a bit of a perspective from the federal government as to what's being done about it. It's fair to say that in the last couple of years, a fair bit has been done about it. I had the good fortune of being asked to serve on the Commission on Cybersecurity for the 44th presidency, and we started up, thanks to Admiral Inman, who got me involved. We had the opportunity to study lots of results that are happening in the federal government. And we issued a report in December of '08, and then and we've issued, I think, 5 reports in total now. But it is fair to say that at the highest levels in the federal government, there is a significantly higher degree of recognition of the cybersecurity problem. So I have a little quote there from President Obama. In fact, if you can actually see him give a speech on YouTube now about the government's kind of position on cybersecurity. But he says things like, America's economic prosperity in the 21st century depends on cybersecurity. There have been a number of reviews launched and so forth. I guess I won't go through all of this. One of the recommendations we made in our first report is that there should be an advisor to the president in cybersecurity. One was named about a year after we recommended it, but one was named nonetheless. Easily the most important thing that happened in 2010 was the creation of the United States Cyber Command. So on May 21st of 2010, the Department of Defense brought into initial operations capability a military presence in cyberspace. So we now have a military presence to defend U.S. interests in cyberspace. So cyberspace has now been identified as a domain, as is the case on the sea, in the air, in space, and on land. Cyberspace is now a domain of conflict and battle. And then it became fully operationally capable in October of last year, and it's supported by the individual military services. And so you can see that there's now an Army Cyber Command called the Second Army, the 10th Fleet from the Navy, the 24th Air Force from the Air Force, down near me in San Antonio, and then the Marine Force Cyberspace Command. So, a lot of activity, but easily the most important was the creation of the Cyber Command. That was extremely important action. Another thing that we're seeing the government do is there's just a heck of a lot of hiring now of cybersecurity professionals, and the fact is they simply can't hire them quickly enough. So this is a little clip from Secretary Napolitano from DHS announcing that they intend to hire up to 1,000 cybersecurity experts. Very, very hard to find them. There are a number of estimates now about how many really deeply technical people are in place now and how many are required. One former CIA official has made the estimate that in terms of the number that are available now, it's about 1,000 who are extremely deeply technical, and that we need about 30,000. So there's this gigantic gap, and you can probably quibble about the numbers, but there's a big gap between the number of people we have and the number of people we need. So people like me who help train the next generation feel like we're helping an important cause by helping to train the next generation. I won't go through this. This is a really technical thing, but we're seeing industry and government basically identify what are some of the skills that people need to have. So it turns out that when a piece of software is compromised, if you looked at what are the errors that the programmers are committing, if you looked at the top 25 errors, these are the top 25 things people do wrong. So even if you did nothing else and you taught people how to program better and they didn't do these 25 bad things, you'd solve a lot of the cybersecurity problems. Basically software is just fundamentally flawed, and the attackers are able to compromise or take advantage of that flaw in software. So if you can remove the flaws in software, you're going to help solve the cybersecurity problem. Okay. What does the future hold? Now, I guess I would mention Will asked me if I'd say something at least somewhat specific about Texas, so I'll do that now. So it turns out in December of this year, the state of Texas has now written into law that before the state of Texas purchases networking gear, the vendors must disclose the vulnerabilities in that technology before the acquisition is made. So I thought that was pretty important, and it's pretty neat, and Texas is taking the lead there. So I guess I wouldn't be a bit surprised if we see going forward other states say, gee, let's make these vendors disclose to us their known vulnerabilities, right? All software has vulnerabilities, and many times the vendors know about it. The vendor should tell the people who are about to make the purchase that, gee, you know, I've got some flaws here, so before you sign on the dotted line, you better disclose it. So I thought that was really good that Texas is doing that. Okay, I don't really have a crystal ball, but maybe I'll borrow this guy's for a minute. I think there's little doubt that I'm safe in saying that the problem will get worse before it gets better. And you know, I've backed that up with a few thoughts. So basically, you know, unlike what we're hearing from Jen about the physical world, cyberspace is a human creation. It's this artificial world. It only has sort of weak ties to the physical worlds. You know, so we know about about Maxwell's equations and about the speed of light and about gravity. Basically, there aren't sort of physical laws like that operate in cyberspace. So it's just a sort of very different domain. So when people make direct comparisons between conflict in the physical world versus conflict in the cyber world, it's a very different kettle of fish. Cyberspace really favors openness and collaboration over security. When you look at the original protocols of the internet, security was just not considered as something that was important. The original designers intended for the place to be open and collaborative, and as a result, offense has the advantage. So you basically walk into this digital realm and you know that the offense has the advantage. There's just no two ways about it. A property of the internet is that it's an anonymous place. And so, when I'm browsing for computer science books on the internet, I don't want to receive an email recommending, engineering books. I just kind of don't want that because I don't want to be bothered. But so, in that case, I like the fact that it's anonymous, but it also creates a situation where attribution is difficult. So if you don't know who people are, it's pretty hard to know when something bad has happened. So that means it's hard for you to identify when something bad has happened. And there's very much a notion of an asymmetry in the nature of cyber attacks. So basically, some 16-year-old working in their garage who is extremely technically sophisticated can attack a major corporation with lots of resources and lots of people and lots of equipment if they're able to figure out a way to get through. So you can basically have a very small actor without necessarily lots of physical assets or resources do great harm. So there's a really asymmetrical nature. And we're really in the middle of an arms race now. And so we're seeing very clearly that the adversaries respond to what the defenders do. So we create a new firewall, the adversaries do something. We create a new antivirus signature, the adversaries do something different. And so again, since you're in this kind of man-made artificial space, there aren't these physical constraints that constrain people. We're seeing that the attackers have the advantage. Another thing that I believe we'll see increasingly in the future is what's referred to as the weakest link. So as the technologists, the engineers, the computer scientists, the mathematicians work to make computers more secure, to make software more secure, it'll increasingly expose the human being as the weakest link. So hackers will frequently report that, well, gee, no, I didn't really have to break that encryption scheme or break that password file or do something technical. All I did was I posed as a friend to the system administrator and got them to give me their password, and I just broke through. And so this is really the area of social engineering. So we're seeing this increasingly where the adversaries are systematically trying to compromise your natural human tendency to trust. So fundamentally, human beings are kind of trusting people. After working in this field for a while, I'm pretty paranoid, I guess. I don't trust maybe as much as I used to. But generally speaking, we sort of like to trust things, and the hackers realize that, and they try to compromise your trust and break through a system that way. We're seeing extremely sophisticated, very, very customized surgical attacks on people's human tendencies here, and this will increase in the future. And let me just close that I and others, and folks I hang out with in Washington, are increasingly persuaded that cybersecurity is what you might call a wicked problem. So there are all kinds of really difficult technical issues. So, I could kind of spout off to you all this technical stuff that, would probably bore you, and they're all pretty challenging. But I'm increasingly persuaded that it goes much beyond that. So, when we put a person on the moon in 1970, that was a hard problem, but it's not a wicked problem. I think cybersecurity is actually a wicked problem, and it goes way beyond just technical issues. There are people issues, there are economic issues, there are policy issues. In many cases, we don't even know what the problem is until we've attempted a solution. It's very possible that in attempting a solution, we actually make the problem worse. I'll give you one example with that, and then I'll close. There's a notion in psychology known as risk homeostasis. And risk homeostasis says people will operate with a certain degree of risk. And if you make them more safe, they'll actually increase their risk level. So there was this study of taxi drivers in New York City. And these taxi drivers were crashing cars and stuff, and they were just doing all these dangerous things. And they decided to give them anti-lock brakes. And so you have a car, and now I've made this car a little bit better, a little safer. So anti-lock brakes allows you to brake more vigorously while cornering. Well, it turns out the incidence of accidents actually went up after they got the anti-lock brakes. And it turned out they ended up trying riskier maneuvers because they thought they could protect themselves. And this happens case after case where you do something that you actually think makes the problem better by including some technology that makes them safer. It actually makes the problem worse. So when people like me are creating new software, new hardware, and so forth, that actually makes people more safe, they may say, gee, I'm going to be, I just installed this new software, I'm going to try something a little bit more risky. And so I think we have the characteristics of a risky problem and of a wicked problem, and here are some other characteristics on the slide. Okay, I think I'm out of time. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Fred. That was fascinating and also a little disconcerting, just as we come to understand that the scope of the threat is probably even worse than we thought. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm the moderator for this panel, but also filling in for one of our previously featured speakers, Ami Petizur, on terrorism. Of course, I'm sure you all see the structural conflict of interest there. If the moderator is also the one who gets to be a speaker, who's going to police me? So I will give my proxy moderation vote to my two colleagues here, so please throw some pens at me if I take us into the afternoon too far. I also did want to mention my personal gratitude and appreciation to Admiral Inman, who not only was one of the visionaries behind this conference. I think in a lot of ways this conference represents his life's work of addressing security problems, whether they're global or national or local. But on a personal note, Admiral Inman played a very strategic role in bringing me here to Austin and to University of Texas. So I'm forever indebted to you there. I thought I would just offer a few overview thoughts on the state and nature of the terrorist threat today globally, including some implications for us here in Austin and in Texas, both on what is working and what is not, and how is the nature of the threat evolving. As many of you are aware, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and that's one obvious vantage point from which to reflect on terrorism as a newer, if not a completely new threat. But I think as the ongoing turbulence in the Middle East, particularly the current operations we have in Libya remind us that terrorism didn't begin with 9/11. It certainly goes back at least to the 1970s and 1980s, arguably even earlier, when in the 80s, when Gaddafi was one of the leading international sponsors of terrorism. And then he abated those efforts somewhat into the 90s and came in from the cold a little bit in the earlier part of this decade. But it's probably no coincidence that one of the 21st century's most lunatic dictators was also one of the late 20th century's chief sponsors of terrorism. And I know that that's at least one of the unspoken concerns of the Obama administration, is that if the current operations against the Gaddafi regime are not fully successful, that he might return to those sort of activities. And we hope that's not the case. To provide just an overview on the current state of affairs on the terrorist threat and on efforts to combat it, I'll first mention, I think, a few positive developments or points. And the first most obvious one is since the 9/11 attacks, the United States government, both the Bush administrations and Obama administrations, have done a number of fundamental things right, just evidenced by the fact that there has not been another successful large-scale attack on the U.S. homeland since then. That's almost something that I think large swaths of the American public take for granted now. Those of you who are involved in law enforcement, I know, understand that part of your job is to help the rest of us take this sort of safety for granted in a psychological way, but we all need to be ever vigilant. But remember back to the weeks and months after September 11th, and if you would have said that 10 years later another such attack would not have happened on the American homeland, it would have been almost inconceivable. And again, that's no accident. It's largely from a number of effective counterterrorism partners that we've enlisted and tactics and strategies that have been developed. More specifically, Al-Qaeda as a threat has been substantially degraded. And again, there's a number of reasons behind this, but they have not gone away, obviously. Bin Laden is still at large, Zawahiri is still at large, and even if they're not providing, we don't see a lot of evidence of active command and control that they're doing for operations, they still are providing ideological inspiration and some of the template there. So whether the degradation of Al-Qaeda Central can continue on its current trajectory remains to be seen. Another qualified success we can point to, arguably, is that Afghanistan has not yet returned to being a completely failed state and safe haven for terrorist groups, terrorist training camps. Again, Afghanistan's really in the crucible right now, and the cost-benefit on our continued operations there and what the outcome might be remains to be seen. And finally, more recently, this so-called Arab Spring, the protests in the Middle East over the last couple of months, beginning in Tunisia and Egypt, and now really sweeping across the region. The outcome of a lot of those is uncertain. I don't want to be by any means Pollyannish or utopian here, saying that it's going to be an unqualified success, but in terms of the fight against terrorism, this Arab Spring provides a very robust counter-narrative to the whole Al-Qaeda worldview and to the grievance narrative that they use to inspire and recruit new terrorists. A lot of this predicated on there's these corrupt, autocratic Arab regimes that are not fully honoring of Islam. They're sponsored by the evil far enemy, the Americans, and Al-Qaeda needs to be at the vanguard of opposition to those regimes. Well, it turns out that the vanguard of opposition to those regimes comes from more largely secular, certainly not Islamist, domestic movements there. As a lot of the people across the average citizens across the region are trying to rise up and reclaim some semblance of accountable government and their own freedoms. So over the long term, this Arab Spring could turn out to be a very significant positive development on the counterterrorism front. And we've even seen that it actually caught Al-Qaeda by surprise. I mean, it took them a few weeks to even come out with some sort of statement on it. And they're not sure if they want to claim credit for it or get out front or still sit on the sidelines, but they've been largely a marginal player. Turning now, though, to a number of concerns or questions about the current state of the terrorist threat and future directions. First, even 10 years in after September 11th, the U.S. has still not developed a really strategic, robust operation in the battle of ideas, or the counter-narrative to how and why new jihadists are recruited and new terrorists are produced. This was something I tried to work on some during my time at the National Security Council in the Bush administration. I think we had a few qualified successes there, but largely failed. This was one of the failures I'd put on our record. Likewise, I think the Obama administration has not been as successful either in this longer-term battle of ideas. We're developing more of an understanding of the complex factors that go into the development and recruitment of terrorists. It seems to be some combination of local grievances, almost the same sort of mentality that inspires young men to join gangs, if you will, but also this globalizing ideology, and that's a kind of a combustible and toxic combination when it comes together. And so addressing all those different factors, that set of ideas and local grievances and pre-existing conditions for how and why terrorists are formed, we in the United States still have not developed a fully robust strategy to counter that. And until we do, there's always going to be more terrorists being produced. Second, there still are a number of terrorist safe havens out there currently, and possible new ones emerging, whether the ungoverned space on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border along the Durand Line, Yemen, a concern and a growing one there, likewise Somalia, others we might point to. I'll mention Pakistan as a concern in its own right. Pakistan has been one of these essential partners and also key problems in the fight against terrorism. And with their current very weak, fragile government and a very compromised intelligence service, if anything, there's concerns that they're becoming even less cooperative and might become more of the problem as they hedge against their own uncertain posture in the region. Another just question or concern I'll point to is the tension between the short-term cooperation we need from other countries, particularly in the broader Middle East, against terrorism, and the longer-term trends in the region, especially the fact that a number of these governments are not seen as very legitimate by their own citizens. So, make it much more specific. For all the concerns we had with the Mubarak regime in Egypt, or the Gaddafi regime in Libya, or the al-Salah government in Yemen, or the government in Jordan, or the Saudi government, they've been by and large very effective partners in monitoring potential terrorists and rounding them up. And that's been one reason why the United States has been kept relatively safe for the last decade. However, we also know that those governments have a lot of problems with corruption, with autocracy, and frankly, with setting some of the conditions that create new terrorists. And so now that there's been sweeping change across the region, we don't have the Mubarak government as a partner anymore. We certainly don't have Gaddafi as a partner on counterterrorism anymore. The fate of the Yemeni government is an hour-by-hour thing. It could be by the end of this conference that they may have been toppled as well. And especially the Saudi government I'll point to. Again, despite all the problems there, they've been effective partners. They're the ones Saudi intelligence who gave us the tip about the airline bomb plot emanating from Yemen last year. But the Saudis are feeling very precarious right now. They're frustrated. They don't feel like the U.S. is supporting them. They've had their intervention in Bahrain. They're worried about their own, the House of Saud losing its own rule. And so over time, to address the root causes of terrorism, there does need to be political reform. There frankly needs to be new, more democratic governments in the region. But in the short term, there's a real trade-off in the loss of their cooperation. Another concern I'll mention is that even 10 years after 9/11, we still don't have in the U.S. a coherent legal regime for the detention of terrorist suspects and for the adjudication of their fate, let alone their rehabilitation. You'll be hearing this afternoon from one of my friends and colleagues, Bobby Chesney, who's a real expert on this. I hope he'll elaborate on that. But right now, it's still just a piecemeal apparatus that's been put in place. No one thinks it's working very well, and yet between the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and Congress, we still have not been able to develop the new paradigm that's needed there. We're particularly here for Texas. I'll point to the concern of homegrown radicalization. This is a concern across the United States. It's been getting some attention from congressional hearings recently, but it's especially relevant here in Texas with the Fort Hood shootings. And Major Nadal, who had been radicalized here in the U.S., but largely from the inspiration of Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen who's now a renegade jihadist in Yemen. And I think the very fact of that shows how these threats really do cross borders, that it's it's not just about an operation maybe being launched from Yemen, but it's about someone in Yemen inspiring would-be jihadists here at home. Yet I would also want to stress, and this is where an important balance needs to be made, that the American Muslim community should not be seen as the threat here, but rather should be seen as the front line of defense. They're the ones who are most able to, police the members of their community, to alert the law enforcement to potential terrorist activity, and to promote a more peaceful, moderate version of Islam against the radical narrative of the jihadist. Finally, I'll mention just the category of, to use Don Rumsfeld's lexicon, unknown unknowns. The beginning of the 9/11 Commission report said that 9/11 in large part was a result of a failure of imagination by the American national security community. No one saw it coming. No one even conceived really that something like this could happen. Of course, now any of us who ever fly and go through all airline security rigmarole know that we now can imagine something like that happening again. But as we've seen with the multiplicity of new terrorist plots, the terrorists are often one step ahead of us there. And those of us who work in whether domestic law enforcement or broader national security issues always need to be striking the balance between imagining the future possibilities of what kind of threats could emerge, what new tactics could be used, but also not doing that at the cost of our own freedoms, our own sanity, really, and not seeing a terrorist behind every bush. So while Al-Qaeda seems degraded, they still do have the capacity to harm. They've mutated into a number of more regional, localized groups, such as Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula, or even just domesticated homegrown cell groups. Likewise, in our own hemisphere, we need to at least imagine the possibility of terrorist inroads in Latin America. Chavez, as Jen and I were talking earlier, in Venezuela recently hosted a little summit in partnership with the government of Iran, brought in the heads of Hamas, a leader from Hezbollah, and a leader from Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We don't quite know what they talked about or what was developed there. That's a classic sort of move that Chavez would make just to poke the Americans in the eye and get us worried when maybe nothing will come of it. On the other hand, we know that Hezbollah is getting more active with Latin American narco traffickers and seeing that as a possible source of revenue. Those same avenues could be used for smuggling WMD possibly, or just terrorist bad actors into the United States. So again, I don't want to sound too alarmist at all. We just need to be aware that those possibilities are out there, and to hedge against them. So. And then finally, I just want to pose the larger grand strategy question here, which is the balance between not overstating the terrorist threat, not making ourselves a permanent garrison state, not ignoring the other national security and global opportunities out there, but also not downplaying it too much. And we always need to be asking ourselves, do the greatest threats to the United States really still come from terrorism, or is it other larger great power actors such as China, for example? So anyway, something we can pick up in the discussion perhaps. Thank you very much. So. All right, well, with that, we will, in our remaining time, turn it over to the audience for any questions for any of us here on the panel.
Looks like there's a question over there.
Oh, okay, yeah, right over here, sure. The microphone's coming your way.
John mentioned about the formation of the cyber command within the military. What steps are being done to protect the private sector, its grids, utility grids, et cetera, and how effective are those steps?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about creating the right partnerships between the private sector and the government. The fact is the private sector is responsible for approximately 85 to 90% of cyber infrastructure. So it's sort of largely up to them to make sure that they're incorporating the right defenses. What needs to happen, though, is a lot more information sharing. So I mentioned in that case of the Google hack, we thought that there were actually lots of companies, but only 3 in addition to Google disclosed. And so people, companies, organizations tend to be pretty reluctant to actually share. So there are activities at the federal level to increase the level of sharing. Overall, you might if you did a report card on how effective is is, kind of in general the nation in protecting cyber infrastructure, you might give it a grade of C, and it would sort of depend. The financial sector does pretty well where money is concerned. They tend to, do well. The Department of Defense is doing pretty well. Education is pretty horrible. There are lots of examples of universities being hacked into, so it would sort of vary. But overall, you might say it's about a C.
Just following up, is that really when there are suspected nation states making concerted efforts in this area, is the private sector enough to be able to, even with improved communications, to address a specific threat?
You'd certainly want involvement from the government where it's appropriate, and so there are certainly techniques and capabilities that are at the classified level that you'd want to just make sure you're communicating that properly. But it's my opinion that the private sector could benefit greatly from information from that realm. But you'd certainly want information sharing. To the extent that it isn't happening, you'd certainly want it to happen.
Fred, if I can actually follow up on that a bit, go back to one of your previous points about how DHS is having a hard time finding enough cybersecurity experts.
Right.
This has always been a puzzle for me, where the U.S. is far and away the leader in the world on developing new technologies in the IT sector. I mean, we're the ones who invented Silicon Valley and a number of the different spin-offs, including our own here in Austin. So with that tremendously robust and dynamic private sector expertise, are there any practical steps you're aware of where U.S. government in particular can tap into that more to develop a more robust cybersecurity infrastructure?
Yeah, so there's actually a specific activity. It's known as the Emerging Security Feedback that's being done in partnership with the government and the private sector, where they're bringing senior people from the private sector in to kind of engage with this kind of topic. Now, when you see companies like Google and Juniper, these big companies, they probably need a little less persuading than they used to about the importance of it. But there is, in fact, exactly that sort of thing happening. I guess I would add to that, talking about the preeminence. Go have a walk through the engineering department or the computer science department, and you'll see a very high number of foreign nationals in our graduate programs. And you're probably aware of that, but you do sort of wonder about that in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I've got it. First this one here, and then the gentleman right behind you. And since you're both together, we'll let you ask your questions in succession, and then the panel will take them. Okay.
It seems to me today that the drug cartels are a lot like the mafia during Prohibition. And I would hope that we have studied what we did during Prohibition to fight against the mafia families. One of the things that we did was use the IRS. Another thing that we did was we took the money away from the mafia families. And I would think that through the cyber world, we ought to be able to follow the money. If you can take the money away from them and make it not profitable, hopefully you'll have some success. Obviously, with Prohibition, we made alcohol legal and we taxed it. I'm not suggesting that, but I am suggesting use the cyber world to follow the money.
Mm-hmm. And the question right behind you.
Hi, Scott Lewis. Just a question about the defense against cyber attacks, and in addition to communications and information security, what about active countermeasures, seeking out and taking out the hackers? Can you share anything with us about that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about the cartels in terms of money. What we're starting to see, or there's evidence that those measures in terms of sort of, if you're talking about seizing bank accounts and this kind of thing of the cartels, has been a tool that's been available, and then what you're actually seeing are the cartels moving just loads of cash back to Mexico. And so they're sort of trying to get around those constraints by physically moving dollars back to the U.S. So it's not to say that they don't use, bank accounts and sort of wiring money and this kind of thing, but you've seen that development in response to those kinds of measures being taken. So, the thing about organized crime is that it's rather adaptable. And so some would say, there's a question earlier about comparing the cartels in Colombia to the ones in Mexico. Most say that there's some huge problems with that comparison because the situation in Colombia was obviously very different. You did have an insurgency, you had the FARC, you had a very different situation than you have in Mexico. That being said, the point about sort of decapitating the cartels in Colombia and removing those cartels, it's true that was effective, but what you've found and what people looking at that situation have said is that now you have much smaller but much flatter organized drug trafficking organizations, and depending on whose numbers you believe, not a huge reduction in the amount of drugs that are leaving Colombia. And so while you may have broken the cartels and potentially their influence on the political system at the sort of state level, you've not actually reduced their ability to get drugs out into the pipelines, and in fact, they've adapted to the new situation.
In terms of following the money, it's a good point, and much activity is happening there. The cyber criminals obviously try to make it pretty difficult. So the underground digital economy is extremely complex with all sorts of levels, people kind of on the ground, people in cyberspace and handing off. And so it's frequently the case that you'll end up capturing somebody, but they're sort of far away from who you really need to capture. But it's a good point, and people are working hard on it. On the notion of taking out the hackers, that's a very interesting question. It relates a little bit to the point I made about anonymity. So it turns out that there are millions and millions of computers that aren't at the control of their owner. So my mom, not so much anymore, but she used to love to use the internet to exchange email. I'd send her pictures of my kids and stuff like that. And approximately once a month, she'd call me and she'd say, "Fred, my computer's running slow again." And I'd basically be like the help desk at the Geek Squad, and I'd try to help her with her computer. What probably happened is her computer had downloaded some software that made her computer perhaps the launching point for an attack. And so maybe my mom's computer was doing something bad. She wasn't at the control of her computer. So the FBI kicks down her door and they're trying to arrest my mom, but my poor mother had nothing to do with it. So it's pretty hard. So people talk about that, but it's called hackback. So a hack happens, let's hack them back. When you do that, are you hacking the right entity or the right computer? And then it brings up some really important policy issues. What constitutes that act, right? So people talk about, with the creation of the Cyber Command, should there be a Cyber Monroe Doctrine? What would constitute an act of war? When Google gets hacked, is that, if you take out an American company, is that an act of war? So it's an interesting issue, but there are some really hard issues, hard policy and other issues that need to be thought through.
Is it a misdemeanor or a felony?
Is what? Oh, it's a felony, yeah. Oh, yeah. You may recall it was about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a big hack at UT, 55,000 Social Security numbers. That individual is in jail now. It's a felony.
Well, I think that shows what kind of world we're living in when even Fred Chang's mother is a national security threat. So anyway, I think it's your turn, Admiral.
I actually have two different ones I'd like you to attack.
One of them is to talk about the implications of privacy and concerns for privacy. Terrorism, tracking cartels, criminal, cybersecurity. The other one that I don't think we've touched on yet much, we spend a lot of time wringing our hands about control of the borders. Best I can tell, it's all focused on what's coming north. What about the southern? And what approach to try to have effective controls on what goes out. I'm thinking about those bundles of cash and the arms.
How about Jen, we'll have you take the border one and Fred on privacy.
Excuse me. In terms of, I actually have some sort of numbers. You know, the what is being done, you know, yes, there is focus on trying to detect cash, and which obviously if it's in big bundles, perhaps a bit easier to track, and trying to track guns that are going south. When they're going down what we call the ant trade, sort of small numbers, a handful of people walking them across, even reports of people taking backpacks full of cash across in very small amounts, it's very hard to detect that. That being said, let me give you a little bit about the guns going across. So there's maybe many of you have seen this. The figure is that 90% of the 90% of the guns used by the cartels come from the U.S. And that came out of at least one source is a GAO report from 2009. Now, several people since have sort of looked at the trade and said, no, it's 90% of the traceable guns that were submitted to the U.S. that were, it's like 87%, were found to be U.S. origin. But that report basically said, okay, I'll give you an example. In 2008, of 30,000 seized in Mexico, 7,200 were submitted to the ATF, Arms, Tobacco, and Firearms, in the U.S. for tracing. 4,000 of those were actually traceable, and 3,480 of these, so 87%, were actually from the U.S. So when you start to look at the numbers in that way, you realize that we can't sort of put 90% of the blame on the U.S. Do guns go south? Yes. They're mainly handguns, semi-automatic rifles, which are converted to be fully automatic in Mexico, and 50 caliber rifles. Those are going south. But the military grade stuff that we're seeing used, the grenades, the RPGs, those are not coming from the U.S. So where are they coming from? There's some reports of leakage from Mexican stocks, from the police, from the military, coming up from Central America. So a lot of leftover military gear from the wars in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, as well as widespread violence and gangs and organized crime and drug trade that's also bringing the guns into those areas, as well as importation. I mean, if the report is that there was a Hezbollah leader, relatively senior leader, who was in Mexico to strike a deal with the FARC in Colombia to exchange guns for cocaine. So the point being, the U.S. is not the only source. Those guns are largely available from other sources. Is it easier to get them if you're on the northern border with U.S.? From the U.S., yes. Is that the only source? No.
So the privacy issue is so interesting. In many ways, I think you can think of cyberspace and technology as really the death of privacy. People talk about the cost of storage. So you can go to a computer store and purchase a certain amount of storage for a certain price. Well, the cost of storage is practically free now. I was reading this article not too long ago, and it talked about you'll be able to, in not a very long time, you'll be able to have something like a cell phone, something the size of a cell phone, that will have so much storage that it will basically be able to record your entire life in high-definition TV for like $100. I mean, right? So from the moment you're born to the moment you die, your entire life is recorded in high-definition TV. When you're sleeping, when you're awake, the whole thing, and it's just sort of available. So this is a pretty standard cell phone, not even a very sophisticated one, but it's got a camera on there. Well, pretty soon this camera will become a video recorder. It'll be connected to the internet. Well, guess what? That sounds like a TV station, right? So my cell phone basically becomes a TV station, and all of a sudden, I'm taking a picture of this audience and I'm broadcasting it in real time. So there's just an extreme challenge at maintaining privacy. So if you think you're secure on a cell phone, so much of telecommunications now is happening over IP. So the technologies that I grew up on, the circuit switch network, are basically being replaced by all of this internet technology. Well, it's really simple to make multiple copies of a telephone call. So I can take that telephone call and I can multiply it, you know, I can just sort of bounce it out there, and suddenly my telephone call is very simply now just, you know, broadcast out. So one of the areas we're going to see a lot of development in is called PET, privacy enhancing technologies. So technologists are going to work really hard. You know, what will it take to create a secure cell phone conversation? What will it take to create a secure internet connection? Right now, basically, no technologies allow privacy. You should sort of view that everything you do and say in cyberspace can be sent almost anywhere. And you know, in many ways, it's been sort of the death of privacy.
Okay, all right.
Sorry.
Well, no, thank you very much. We've come up right up to the end of our panel, so please join me in thanking a round of applause for our panelists here. Thank you. Wow.